Thank you all for joining our webinar today. I'm Eddie Uri with Resources for Sustainable Communities. We're joining you live here with this virtual event from Bellingham, traditional Coast Salish territory. And of course, this event is a part of the City of Bellingham's Climate Action Week. And we are joined here by Stephanie from the City of Bellingham to kick it off and welcome us to this week of events. So Stephanie.
Thanks, Eddie, and hi everyone. Like Eddie said, my name is Stephanie Silencion. I do environmental education and outreach work with the City of Bellingham, and we're excited to have Resources host this event today as part of our second annual All In for Climate Action Week. Climate Action Week is a celebration of all the knowledge, progress, and resources that our community has to offer when looking for solutions to address global climate change at the local level. Our community has put together a great list of events for this week. You can find a full list and learn about steps that you can take to reduce your personal impact by visiting www.cob.org/all-in. Thank you, and I look forward to the event.
All right, well, thanks so much, Stephanie. We're also joined by our co-panelists, Denise Grab and Erin McDade. Take a moment to introduce yourselves.
Sure, I can start. So hi everyone, my name is Erin McDade. I'm the Senior Program Director for Architecture 2030, and our org is working on decarbonizing the building sector globally as a means to addressing the climate crisis. Some of you may also know me because I served on the Bellingham Climate Action Task Force up until last December when we completed our work.
And my name is Denise Grab. I am a manager at Rocky Mountain Institute. Rocky Mountain Institute is an organization that transforms the global energy economy to create a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. We have a building electrification program, which is where I work, and I oversee our work in the West. So Washington is one of the states we are focusing on, and I'm excited to be here today. Thank you for the invite, Eddie and team.
Well, it's great to have you both here. I'm just want to make sure technically this is working. Is everyone seeing the homepage slide right now?
We're good.
Okay, we're good. So let's dive into it. What are we here to talk about? I'm sure everyone knows, I won't spend too much time on it, but climate change is an existential crisis. It's caused by burning fossil fuels primarily, and pretty much every facet of our society is involved and that needs to be changed in order to address that problem. Everything from the buildings we build and inhabit, our transportation systems, agriculture and farming, our consumption, forestry, across the board. But luckily, at this point in time, we know the solutions and what needs to be done in each of these sectors. And today we're going to focus on buildings. Though climate change is a global crisis and problem, many of the solutions have to be addressed at the local level. International agreements, federal action, these things are necessary, but so is action at the municipal, state, city, and county level, because areas like buildings, transportation systems, our utilities, land use, and urban planning, all is managed at the local level. It can't be done higher up than that. So we have to be taking action in Bellingham, not just in our individual lives, but as a matter of policy, and engage in the civic space. Natural gas, one of the primary contributors to global warming. It is primarily made up of methane, a greenhouse gas that has a global warming potential of 84 times greater than carbon dioxide when released uncombusted, and also when combusted contributes to global warming. And it is mostly, I think, about 3/4 of the gas currently consumed in the US is from hydraulic fracturing, a new technology method that really started booming in the 21st century, that involves injecting toxic chemicals deep into the ground and then creating an explosion. And that's primarily where our gas, pretty much all gas in the pipeline is made up of frack gas. And it's dangerous to burn, to transport, to store. There's impacts across the board that we have to take into account just beyond climate. Our gas is almost entirely supplied by Canada, British Columbia and Alberta. And so that's just another issue where if we're dependent for our basic energy needs on a source that's 1,000 miles away and has to travel physically through a pipeline system that's vulnerable to ruptures, that actually puts us in a position of dependency and less security. So there's all sorts of reasons why we need to be heading in the direction to go beyond gas. Whereas, 20 years ago, there may have been lots of good reasons to be using gas, but where we're at in time now, there's no reason to not move in a different direction. And the path forward is steps happening in concert that we need to stop burning fossil fuels to generate electricity. We have the technology and economics are there to do that, and the transition's underway. We need to increase efficiency, and we'll talk about more ways to do that. And we need to electrify pretty much everything that we're currently dependent on burning fossil fuels directly for, not only vehicles, but what we're talking about here today is primarily about our heating needs in the home for heating water in spaces and cooking. There's good news that last year, Washington State joined several other states in the US in passing a law that's actually mandating that utilities eliminate fossil fuels from our power grid through a series of steps over time. They have to make progress on, and this is underway. So there will be no more coal burned for electricity generation by 2025 or sooner even. We're on track. The utilities will have to provide net zero carbon electricity sources by 2030, and may still maintain gas-fired power plants to maintain a smooth, reliable grid until adequate storage and distribution is built, but they have to shut down all existing gas plants by 2045 or sooner. And there's lots of opportunities we could talk about in a later date about going solar locally, where if you're a homeowner now and you have a sunny roof, you're losing money by not installing solar. And you can get that paid for zero down, low interest loans, financing, rebates. That basically means, you fill out some paperwork, you get solar on your roof and you pay less in bills. It's a good way to go. But for those who don't own homes, we need to be expanding community solar, and just solar in general in public spaces and in private buildings to really do our part in every place. We're working on that in some other areas. In efficiency, we have some great programs locally like the Community Energy Challenge with Opportunity Council, Sustainable Connections, working with businesses, homeowners. They're doing energy audits, helping folks weatherize, improve their conservation, reduce their bills and their energy use. And there's innovations in technology for smart grids, smart buildings, a more efficient supply of electricity, bringing it into the 21st century. And technology for just home appliances you could buy right now, LED bulbs, and we'll talk more about other substitutes for gas, are really better than they've ever been, and the cost just keeps dropping every year. So when we're talking about electrifying buildings, Erin will talk about this more, but new buildings are a lot easier. If we're building new, we can build it the right way, efficient design, actually lower the cost of construction, maintenance, and bills. And in general, this is the direction that the building industry is going. In Seattle, 2/3 of the buildings built in the last couple of years were electric heat. In Vancouver, BC, nearby, it was over 90% of single-family homes built last year were already all electric. So this is already a trend, but we need to make sure that if we're building buildings that are built to run on gas, we're locking in either a future cost to upgrade later or decades of gas consumption that could be avoided at a time we need to transition. Existing buildings, a little more complicated. It depends on the situation. It could be low cost, it could be higher cost depending. But we'll talk about the challenges to that. You may not be familiar with some of the new technologies that are out there. When we think about electric heat, folks might think of baseboards, they might think of electric resistant stoves. We're not talking about that. We're talking about newer efficient technologies like heat pumps, which also can double as air conditioners and use half as much energy as a gas furnace and heat buildings reliably and safely. There's induction stoves is a great technology. I use one at home now since learning about the impacts of gas, that find it's just a better stove than a gas could be. It's far more responsive. You can change temperature in real time and avoid burning things. They're just excellent and much lower energy use. And right now with water heaters, the best, the best heat pump electric water heaters are going to be cost comparable to a good gas heater, and also use less energy and cost less in bills to operate. So it's out there, but we need to just shift in the direction. It's about changing the path that we're on. We got to talk about city policy, things like code and development rules for buildings. We can talk about incentives and financing to help folks in existing buildings transition. There's some great new policies coming online. We don't have time to go into too much depth on, but this is actually underway in the city right now, where they're working on developing more policies to bring forward. That, of course, will all go through public process, but it's being worked on. And thankfully, we have a city government that takes this seriously and is engaged in taking steps forward. But they need to hear from people to encourage it, support it, keep it moving, and get it going, and not waste time. We have to look at just public buildings that are already in the control of taxpayer dollars, not just the city, but say the school district. That's so that they're not building new buildings that are also locking us into that cost of continuing to use gas. That can be avoided, but we have to make sure we steer in another direction. So we're going to come back and do Q&A actually at the end. I want to encourage folks. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a button that says Q&A in the Zoom box. You can type in, as these presentations are going, type your questions into the Q&A box, and when we come back at the end, we will get to responding them from all of the panelists. Leaving it there, I think we're going to kick it over to Erin to talk more about building code and more. Yeah, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Eddie. You set that up well. I know I have, and I can quickly, but I'm really excited to talk about how to create policies to decarbonize both new and existing buildings. This is work that I've been doing within my org for the last 4 or 5 years now. But before that, I just want to do a little bit of kind of framing of the urgency here. We're in the middle of Climate Week, so I'm assuming many of you had seen this. I hadn't really seen this until yesterday. That's an installation right now in New York City that is showing how many years, days, et cetera, we have to make impactful moves in climate before it is too late, essentially. And I think there's sometimes some confusion here that this 7 years, 10 years, this doesn't mean that within 10 years, all of the climate change impacts are going to be hitting us, although they're already hitting us. What this means is that there's a threshold in terms of temperature increases, that if we pass that threshold, then climate change spins out of control. These feedback loops kick into place and we are no longer able to mitigate it. But if we do not pass that threshold, then we can mitigate climate change and bring it back to pre-industrial levels. And so that's what this number means. And 7 years, especially when we're talking about creating and implementing policy, is not much. So I have a pretty big sense of urgency around all of this that feels even stronger after seeing this yesterday, despite the fact that this is what I do day in and day out. So wanted to start there, but that's not specifically what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about how we decarbonize our buildings, as Eddie said. So let's dive into that. The first thing to look at when we're decarbonizing our buildings is, what do our building stocks actually look like? So a typical developed city building stock emissions trend, starting pre-2020 going to 2040, which is when we need to decarbonize globally. We see that existing buildings are the majority of the emissions. And this will vary slightly depending on the city and various characteristics, but as a general trend for every developed city, existing buildings are the majority of the emissions. And if we break that down a little bit farther to look at where the fuel sources are coming from for those, for most developed cities, again, 40% about of the emissions by 2040, if we don't take any action, will be from gas. And Eddie just talked a little bit about why that's problematic. But the really interesting thing is that all of our electricity grids are decarbonizing globally. And again, Eddie just mentioned CETA. So in Washington State, we have mandated electricity decarbonization by 2045. Assuming that our grids actually get there sooner by 2040 because we need to, then if we take no action in our building sector, guess where all the emissions are coming from? So clearly we need to address this piece, the gas piece, which is why we're focusing on electrification. And just to emphasize that this applies to Bellingham as well. Our existing building and new buildings breakdown of emissions by 2035, which is our city's target year for zero carbon, actually aligns exactly with that average that, that we have from the compilation of tons of city data. And again, if we take no action, about 58% of our building stock emissions in 2035 will be from gas. The other 42% will be from electricity because our grid isn't mandated to get clean until 2045 again. Fingers crossed it happens sooner and maybe this whole piece of the pie is gone in 2035. So those charts show that existing buildings are the biggest emitters for cities, but new construction is not unimportant. And here's one way that we can understand that. And that's that projections show that we're expected to build 2.4 trillion more square feet of buildings in the next couple of decades. And this is essentially double the current existing world building stock. It's the same as building an entire New York City once a month for the foreseeable future. So clearly the big building or the new buildings piece is going to be critical, and decarbonization policies for new buildings are going to be critical. And every single decarbonization policy for new construction will require the same three things. And I sometimes talk about this as the three-legged stool of decarbonization. We must have efficient new construction that must be fully electric, so no fossil fuel consumption on site. And all of the electricity demands for this efficient all-electric building must be met using either on-site generated or off-site procured renewable energy, carbon-free renewable energy. So in some levels it's pretty straightforward what we have to do. And there's significant global momentum for all three of the pieces of that three-legged stool. We as a building industry have been working on efficiency for decades and decades and decades. We have standards, codes, et cetera, across at least most of the global north, and some international standards that can be applicable anywhere already in place. Electrification is the new hot topic, and there is significantly less global movement than there is in efficiency, but there is not none. In the United States, as probably most of you are aware, California has been leading this charge. Berkeley banned natural gas in new buildings in 2019, and to date, 33 other jurisdictions in the state have either electrification or decarbonization ordinances. And significantly, meaningfully, PG&E, the biggest investor-owned utility in California, came out saying that they fully support all electric buildings. They're all in, and this is huge. And then globally, no surprise to those of us in the industry, Europe has been and likely will continue to lead with decarbonization and electrification. And then renewable energy, similar. There are standards that are implementable and adoptable being developed or already in place in Europe, in China, and recently, due to work from the American Institute of Architects and my org, Architecture 2030, the International Energy Conservation Code that will be published in October has an internationally adoptable renewable energy standard. And so to kind of consolidate all this and make it really easy, Architecture 2030 developed what we call the Zero Code, which is an internationally applicable building code standard for zero carbon construction. And so this can be adopted by any jurisdiction in the world and will tackle the three pieces of the three-legged stool and result in zero carbon construction. But the decarbonizing of existing buildings is really, again, not only where the majority of the emissions are, but where the more challenging policy implementation pieces present themselves. So big picture, and this is, the whole reason for the existence of my organization in a sense, is that urban environments are responsible for 75% of the world's total human-produced greenhouse gas emissions. And then within those urban environments, buildings are responsible for the majority of all emissions. And for all these cities, the yellow is the percent of emissions that buildings are responsible for. Even in Bellingham, the number isn't as high, but the building sector is the single biggest sector of emissions above transportation, industry, et cetera. And then looking at just those building sectors, significant finding from Architecture 2030's work over the last 3 or 4 years is that there is a significant split between big buildings and small buildings in terms of how those emissions are being generated. So as an example, in Seattle, 2.8% of the total buildings, so really not many, are responsible for 45% of total building sector emissions. And what that means is that all the rest, in this case, almost 200,000 buildings, are responsible for the other 55% of building sector emissions. And that has significant implications from a policy perspective. And just to demonstrate that the trend does hold, in Bellingham, it's maybe not as dramatic of a downtown, but 6% of our total buildings, which is under 1,500 in the city, are responsible for 52% of our emissions, whereas almost 24,000 small buildings are responsible for that other 48%. And again, I'll dive into it, but the policy implications of this are significant. So Architecture 2030 created a framework for developing existing building decarbonization policy. And it hinges again on the three-legged stool that is, no matter if we're talking existing buildings, new construction, retrofits, always going to be the case: efficiency, electrification, and renewable energy. And the framework helps to distinguish between the various policy mechanisms that different subsectors of a city's building stock will require. And it's pretty critical for policymakers to understand, and for those of us who are advocating for it to understand, that it's not going to be one size fits all for our existing building stock. So the framework we created has a few simple questions that we can use to get started on developing those specific policies. So the first one is who will be affected by the policy, and that typically means either commercial or residential, big or small, owner occupied or renter occupied. There are many different who's that can be segmented, and there's, you know, I'll dive into how you look at that. Then what will the policy require? And this is typically either a choice between a performance-based policy, which allows more choice but requires more decision making. A performance-based policy just sets a target and says, we don't care how you get there. And a performance policy is always going to require a pre and post project audit to ensure that the targets were met. And this increases time and money. So there are pluses and negatives to a performance-based policy or a prescriptive-based policy, which is essentially the opposite. This says exactly you need to do X, Y, and Z to your building. So that offers less choice, of course, but it also requires a lot less decision making on the part of the building owner. And this is ideal for who's that don't have significant variation in their building system. So in what types of systems are heating and cooling, et cetera, their buildings. And this is something we frequently find in single family residential construction, for example. And then prescriptive policies are also ideal for large quantities of who's, when, as we saw with those big buildings, small building slides, again, it's the small buildings typically that are tens to hundreds of thousands of buildings in the city. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. And then the last question is when will the policy affect the buildings? And the two choices there are typically either a date certain policy, so by 2030, all buildings must X, or phased at intervention points. And intervention points are pretty critical. So I'm going to spend a second here talking about what we mean by that. So intervention points include planned capital improvement cycles, which most big buildings have, and then a whole point of list: point of sale when a building's sold, point of lease, point of renovation, or point of equipment replacement. And then finally, life safety and resiliency upgrades. So for example, a seismic retrofit would be another intervention point, a time at which the building is touched. And the reason that we align policies with intervention points is that they significantly reduce upgrade costs. They reduce disruption to the occupants if the building is already being touched. And for various reasons that we probably don't have time to get into, aligning with intervention points significantly increases financing options, which is critical for overcoming especially upfront cost barriers. So a lot more information can be found on our website, achieving-zero.org, about intervention points. So then quickly, to demonstrate how this framework of asking those questions works to actually start building a policy, I'm gonna give a quick example of, say, we're gonna split it into big buildings and small buildings, since we saw that those are pretty critical, each with their own critical set of emissions. So the key characteristics of a set of big buildings in a city are that, again, there are not typically very many of them. They represent a small percentage of the buildings, of the city's total building stock. They typically have a capital budget. They are larger buildings with a planned, long-term planned and long-term budget in place for upgrades and interventions. And they have a lot of variations in their mechanical systems and what their heating and their cooling, et cetera, looks like. So starting with the who, we know it's big buildings, but are there subsections of that we want to look at? And as an example, multifamily versus commercial might be important due to the different type of occupancy. And then looking at the what, and this goes back to those kind of benefits. What our research indicates is best for big buildings is that the policies are performance, or there is the option of both performance and prescriptive. And the reason that performance aligns well with this subsector of buildings is that it allows for choice. We talked about, and these buildings have significant system variation, so each building is going to need to figure out what works best for their specific building to decarbonize. And then the performance-based policy allows for alignment with already planned upgrades that most large buildings typically have. And then finally, the when, again, phased with intervention points or date certain. We recommend that these policies are date certain policies because, again, those capital budgets and capital improvement cycles are typically already in place, and this gives owners the time to decide when they're going to make their upgrades in alignment with their already planned upgrades. And then doing the same thing for small buildings. What are the key characteristics here? So we know that it's tens or hundreds of thousands of buildings. In Bellingham, it's almost 24,000. So a lot that we need to touch. We know that upfront costs are a critical barrier because of who is occupying these smaller buildings. And, you know, it's usually single family homes and small multifamily homes that are renter or owner occupied. And we know that these buildings typically have similar heating and cooling, et cetera, systems from building to building, not much variation. So same three questions, we can see that a further segmenting of owner occupied versus renter occupied as an example could be an important segmentation. Then the what for this one, research is pretty clear on this one that the requirement should be prescriptive because they eliminate the time and money associated with those audits that you need to ensure you've met the requirements for a performance-based policy, and they reduce the amount of decision-making necessary, which, again, given the typical owners and inhabitants of these buildings, less decision-making is typically preferred, and it eases the implementation of the whole upgrade package. And then, again, this is the time when those intervention points become pretty important. So we certainly recommend that small building upgrades are phased to align with a point of sale or a point of renovation or a point of equipment replacement intervention point, because again, most affordable, most financing options. But interestingly too, if you think about it, there are, you know, tens to hundreds of thousands of buildings in a city. If it's aligned with a consistent and phased upgrade period, this guarantees a upgrade market and a workforce and economic growth within the city that that is, you know, a strong co-benefit to this whole decarbonization process. And I will end on the policy piece with something that is super critical, enough so that it requires its whole own other presentation, and we just don't have time to talk about all this yet. Eddie touched on some of it, but the financing piece is absolutely critical, and there is significant precedent for how to finance this type of work. But all decarbonization policies should make sure that that financing and the support is prioritized for frontline communities, and that incentives are provided for early adopters to really fast track this whole process. So all of this and much more can be found on achievingzero.org for helping implement the policies. And, you know, the examples I show demonstrate that, I mean, it's not like I just wrote policy right there, but it demonstrates that the process of getting at how to create the right policies and the policy frameworks are pretty straightforward and achievable for any of us. But again, just to bring it back, this has to happen so quickly. So I don't really know what to say other than that the urgency of getting out here and getting our legislators to start taking action and implementing these policies that we know how to do, we know it needs to be done, we know how the policy needs to be structured, we know how to finance it, the technology exists. We have to get this done today. And I will end there and pass it to Denise.
Thanks, Erin. I think that there might be a poll that the resources, there we go. So folks can fill this out, seeing how much you know about the types of tools available for electrification of our buildings.
Give it about 20 more seconds.
I'll let the resources moderators respond to the poll.
Well, this is interesting information. It's looking like the majority of you familiar with heat pumps. Only 30% of you are familiar with induction stoves. Or I guess it would, or maybe half would say a little. So that's something we can talk about more, I think, when we get toward the end of the presentation, but I want to make sure that Denise has time to get through her piece. But I think we'll come back for Q&A at the end. Some of the questions in the chat we are just answering directly with typed answers, you can see, and I think a few of them we will bring up and speak to at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, and realized quickly we made a mistake on the poll. It only allowed you to select either heat pumps or induction stoves. Apologies there.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay. So the second one gives us a more accurate.
But yeah, it's still interesting information. Anyway, I will end the poll. Thank you all for taking a moment to answer that.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, so I will be talking today about the health effects of decarbonizing buildings. So as it turns out, there aren't, the benefits from decarbonizing buildings are not just climate benefits. They're actually substantial co-benefits from health impacts that can be achieved from decarbonizing buildings. So I'm going to talk about that today. And these benefits occur both indoors and outdoors from these pollutants. So there are gas stoves and other appliances emit nitrogen dioxide and other pollution indoors. And that's a profound issue for especially children and low-income communities. And then there are other appliances, namely water heaters and furnaces, anything that's vented outside, that emit nitrogen oxide at levels that exceed all of the power plants in this state. So that's a profound issue for outdoor air quality as well. And then I'll delve into how electrifying the state's 1.25 million buildings that burn fossil fuels is crucial, not just for the climate goals, but also to secure clean and healthy air for all Washingtonians. So starting by diving into indoor air quality. So these stats were actually pretty shocking to a lot of us who were entering the building electrification field from other areas. I had come at this field from other types of climate policy, and I hadn't realized how other climate and air quality policy, and I hadn't realized how much pollution is building up in our homes, and particularly how much pollution is building up from gas stoves in ways we didn't even realize. So we spend about 90% of our time indoors, and that was a statistic from before COVID. So you can imagine how much higher it might be now that we're kind of in our homes majority of the time. And according to EPA data, indoor pollutant levels may be 2 to 5 and up to 100 times higher indoors than outdoors. And gas stoves are a huge contributor to that problem. So there are pollutants that occur just from cooking that apply both to electric and gas stoves, like particulate matter. Those are the types of things that happen usually when you burn your food, the types of things people are aware of when you burn your stir fry and you smell the smoke, you know to turn on the fan. But what we're talking about with this nitrogen dioxide pollution from gas stoves, it's colorless, odorless. It damages your lungs without you even realizing it does. And it occurs anytime the stove is on. So if you're boiling water to make some pasta, or you're turning on your oven to bake a potato, anytime you turn that flame on, it's creating nitrogen dioxide emissions. And homes with gas stoves have 50 to 400% higher nitrogen dioxide emissions than homes with electric stoves. So electric stoves don't emit that NO2 pollution. There are some other pollutants that are unique to gas stoves as well, including carbon monoxide and formaldehyde, but we will focus on nitrogen dioxide today. So these emissions from nitrogen dioxide in gas stoves often exceed outdoor air quality standards. So levels of NO2 emissions from cooking at home would violate outdoor air quality standards if you were outside. So shocking, dangerous levels that EPA and other entities have said are damaging to your health are being found indoors from relatively short amounts of cooking. So just baking a cake in your oven, your kitchen can reach 230 parts per billion. In contrast, the US EPA national outdoor standard for level of harm to human health over 1 hour is 100 parts per billion. According to the Canada national standard, it's even lower, 60 parts per billion. Compare that to something like roasting meat in your oven, that's 296 parts per billion, and even just boiling water is 184 parts per billion. So really, you can reach really dangerous levels of NO2 inside just from turning on your stove. And the health effects of nitrogen dioxide, particularly in children, can be very severe. So it can cause irritated airways, aggravated respiratory symptoms, increased susceptibility to lung infections, cardiovascular effects, increased susceptibility to allergens, and notably an increased risk of childhood asthma, both current and lifetime. So not only does it increase the likelihood and risk of individual asthma incidences, i.e. If you're exposed to this NO2 pollution, you're more likely to have an asthma attack. It can actually increase your likelihood of being diagnosed with asthma in the first place. I.e. gas stoves can contribute to coming down with asthma in the first place. And specifically, children who are living in a home with a gas stove relative to those living in a home with an electric stove have a 42% increased risk of experiencing asthma symptoms and a 24% increased risk in being diagnosed with asthma in the first place, which is just shocking and terrifying. And I certainly know that if and when I have kids, I will not be using a gas stove around them, particularly when they're young. And children are more vulnerable to this pollution than adults because of their higher breathing rates and more physical activity, their relatively immature and growing lungs, and their higher lung surface area to body ratios. This problem is particularly acute in lower income communities and households for a number of reasons. First of all, there's already greater asthma burden and higher outdoor pollution levels in these communities. So lungs of folks in these communities are often already under more respiratory stress and therefore more aggravated by the NO2 that comes from stoves. In addition, a lot of the housing stock in lower income communities are older. They have inadequate ventilation. The there either is no ventilation, the requirement, Washington does have, to my understanding, and Erin can correct me if I'm wrong, Washington does have a requirement to have ventilation in homes now, but it hasn't always. That's relatively recent. And so some older homes may not have ventilation at all. And also people may not know to turn on their ventilation anytime they're cooking, or it may be inadequate in older homes. So it's important, as I mentioned before, to turn on your ventilation anytime you're cooking, but you may not be aware that that's necessary. And in addition, in these lower income communities, the units are often smaller, which allows the pollution to accumulate more in the small space, and there are often more people per home, which means more cooking in the space. So those are some of the reasons that this is a profound equity issue as well. And then looking at the health costs of cooking with gas stoves, it's not zero. Over 600,000 people in the state have asthma, and there are 73 million in direct hospital costs due to asthma each year. That's not even including all the lost days of work, all the lost days of school, all the other economic impacts of asthma. That's just including direct hospital bills. The average cost of each hospitalization for asthma in 2010 in Washington was $14,600 for each hospitalization, and approximately 60% of that was covered from taxpayer funding through Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. Meanwhile, studies have shown that a study in Australia that was looking to attribute that jurisdiction's asthma burden to gas stoves found that 12.3% of the childhood asthma burden in Australia was attributable solely to gas stove pollution. So basically, if you removed gas stoves from those homes, you would have a 12.3% lower rate of asthma in Australia. There hasn't yet been a similar study for the US, but we understand that hopefully will be happening soon. And so when you look at that decrease in asthma burden and the cost of these hospitalizations, even if you're just looking at money alone, not to mention the human life impact of this, the cost of an electric stove starts to look like a real monetary bargain. So what can you do as an individual to reduce or eliminate your risk and exposure to gas stove pollution? So you can install and maintain carbon monoxide detectors. As I mentioned, carbon monoxide is an issue here. Make sure that you run your exhaust hood anytime you're cooking, and that you open a window anytime you're cooking, and cook on the back burners, which tend to capture more of this pollution. But if you want to avoid all of that pollution entirely, switch to an electric or an induction stove. You avoid nitrogen dioxide emissions entirely if you switch to an electric or induction stove. If you're kind of on the fence about whether to, spend money trading out your entire stove, you can try one of those plug-in induction stoves. I think Eddie had a picture of that in his presentation. Some of those run for $50. You can just buy one and test it out, see if you like it. I expect you will, based on experience of me and many of my friends. And these are some recommendations for policymakers about what they can do for indoor air quality. So they range from indoor air quality guidelines, better ventilation protections and building codes, warning labels, and incentives to phase out gas stoves and other appliances. Now switching over to the outdoor side of the puzzle, it's not just gas stoves that pollute inside. Other types of appliances that vent outside add to air pollution outside. So this is primarily water heaters and furnaces, a little bit dryers, and to a lesser extent, gas stoves. The NOx pollution, NOx, nitrogen oxides, becomes smog and particulate matter outside based on reactions with the sun and other materials outside. And so this is what becomes that pollution that damages our lungs and causes increased risk of premature death and other ailments outside. And residential and commercial buildings combined actually produce more of that NOx pollution, 28 tons per day, than all the power plants put together in the state, which currently is only 22 tons per day. And that's including coal, right? So as we phase out coal in the state, that number is going to get even smaller. And unless we address the gas appliances in our buildings, we expect that number to get even bigger. So this is how NOx turns into ozone and particulate matter when it's outside. So these are the pollutants that tend to be formed from that NOx that goes outside. And in order to address these pollution impacts of gas appliances, we need to replace our gas burning water heaters and furnaces with clean, efficient electric heat pump technology. And as Erin mentioned, we can do that often at end of appliance life. So there are opportunities for Bellingham, for Washington to potentially put in requirements to phase out these electric water heaters and furnaces at end of life, to switch them out for clean all electric alternatives based on climate and on air quality impacts from these appliances. So that's it from me. Plenty more of information on the RMI website, rmi.org, or you can ask me questions at dgrab@rmi.org. Thank you again.
Well, thanks for that, Denise and Erin. I think everyone learned something today. We do have 10 minutes left to take some time to answer your questions. And I say, I think we're just gonna pull some out. I know a few I could take a stab at, but would either of you like to jump in on any of these?
Do you want me to talk about financing a little bit, Eddie, or is that too complicated of a path to go down right now?
Let's just be short and sweet. But yeah, there was a few questions in that area. Yeah, why don't you take a stab at it?
Okay, yeah, and I will be short and sweet. There is a lot of information on this, and there are other talks that I've given, other talks that other people have given out there. But I mentioned a few financing mechanisms that we already have in place in other parts of the country that are not currently being implemented in the state or in Whatcom County or in the city of Bellingham. The two most commonly known ones are PACE or CPACER for our commercial, which we just passed in Washington State, which is called property assessed clean energy financing. So essentially it's financing where there's no upfront costs, and it's private. It's usually a private source of funding or like a private public collaboration, and that that initial loan, if you will, is covered by them, and then the balance of that is paid off over 25 to 30 years, typically on the property's property bill. So it means that that upfront cost for building owners to do any sort of upgrades, including electrification, is gone. And then it's amortized over a 25 to 30 year period. And this is super popular and successful. It's been enabled in 30 plus states, and we just enabled it in Washington State for commercial buildings, and we now need to enable it in Washington State for residential buildings. The other one is on bill financing. It's very similar, but it's usually run through a utility instead of through a private and like maybe city collaboration like PACE, where the utility covers the upfront costs of the upgrade, and then the building owner pays that cost back on their utility bill over a set period of time, 10 to 20 years. In Orcas Island, right across from us, they have this really awesome program, on-bill financing program through Orcas Power and Light, which is their publicly owned utility. It's not an investor-owned utility, where they, the publicly owned utility gives building owners up to $15,000 to cover upfront costs of electrification. And then that is paid back on their bill And I do believe that they have a condition in place too, that the amount that you pay back on your monthly utility bill must be less than the savings that you get from electrification. Sorry, that was a little but essentially when you electrify, your utility bill is going to reduce because it's so much more efficient. Your electric bill is going to reduce. And so they don't charge you more than that reduction, meaning that even with paying back the loan, your utility bill every month is reduced. So it's not only no upfront cost, but it reduces the long-term costs for building owners. And so the programs like that don't require city financing, and they don't require tons of individual upfront capital, and yet they allow for all of this to happen very successfully, and we need to get those in place here ASAP.
Excellent. And I would add on to that a little bit. Granted that there are lots of mechanisms available, existing ones and ones that we can implement in Bellingham that in many ways can make, will save people money across the board while increasing the value of property by making these upgrades and conversions, and avoid future costs from, just what it costs to have to maintain and continue to burn gas. There are, of course, some challenges. We have to recognize in the real world, especially, there's examples of when it comes to a renter, whereas the property owner is the one who would pay for a conversion or an upgrade, but the renter is the one who pays the bills. It's what we call the split incentive, where the property owner doesn't gain anything, whereas if they were paying the bills and utilities, they would by doing it. Those are areas that we need to address through really prescriptive policy. And as a general rule here, right, when we approach climate, then the solutions we need to achieve, we do that while also holding other values and other concerns around housing and equity and fairness and justice and quality of life and community and all these other things we have to consider. And so I don't know of anyone who is interested in trying to put any kind of unfunded mandate on people or present policy that's going to raise the cost of living in any way, because we all know we're already in a housing crisis. We do need to build more, and when we build more, we should build the right way, which will be good across the board. But when it comes to those existing buildings, it's a case-by-case basis, and the policy making process for this will be for any measures that get brought forward by the city are going to go through lots of stakeholder engagement and opportunity to find solutions that can really work and be, where things will be done as combinations of policies at the same time. But I think we're optimistic that we can and will get there. And this is also something that's not going to be done overnight. It's going to be done over the next couple of decades, right? We're not talking about everyone all of a sudden throwing out their brand new furnace that was just installed. That's not realistic. But the idea is that as our grid is transitioning to be fossil fuel free, so should our homes and buildings to not be now's the time to be pivoting to be burning, using electricity instead as the grid is getting cleaner year by year. And the research shows that even in a grid that is partially powered by fossil fuels like ours, there is still a climate benefit. There is still a reduction in energy and fossil fuels being burned by switching to these efficient electric appliances. I want to get to Jacob's question about how CETA works, but first, do either of you have any more thoughts to add on those questions about, or what, building on that?
I would say on the financing piece for renters, there are some creative solutions that are being proposed in a number of states. So there are some folks in California who have been brainstorming on bill financing for accessible financing that would be equally applicable to renters as well as homeowners and would run with the property. So that's an opportunity that's being explored in California. There's a financing proceeding at the PU's Public Utilities Commission in California about how to effectively finance these transitions with an eye toward equity and making sure that everyone has access to these opportunities.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done on that, and the economics and it's being considered and researched across the board. There's lots of benefits, and undeniably there's some costs, and those are challenges that we need to meet. But I know we only got a couple minutes left. I do want to say there's a question about how net zero emissions works. And basically, by 2030, it'll be the case that as much electricity as consumed in Washington will be generated by renewable zero carbon sources, but the gas plants will be online as far as maintaining a smooth, reliable grid. But the amount of gas being burned will be reduced by 2030. There will be no increase in gas being burned over this decade for power. But then there will be steps to phase out those existing plants until we have the infrastructure we need to have 100% renewable powered grid. It's a lot we got to build. It's going to be a huge economic stimulus, thousands and thousands of jobs. It's one of the fastest growing sectors in the world and in the US and Washington, but yeah, that's where we're going with it. I don't know if we have time to get to more questions today because we do have to end at 1, but I would encourage you to email me or the other panelists. You can reach me at cleanenergy@re-sources.org, is the easiest way to remember it. And we'll do our best to follow up and connect you with experts or folks that can assist in the various ways information you're looking for, and encourage you to engage and pay attention to city processes and policies as they're proceeding, and get on our email list and visit our website. Follow us on Facebook. We are going to be updating the community, doing more events like this with more information because we really just scratched the surface in this hour, and this is there to be continued. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and I hope you check out some of the other great events this week and learn some more about the work being done for climate action in Bellingham. So best to all.